Welcome to North Stories. I don't remember much about my first years, though that might surprise some people. Maybe that's part of being from Belfast, growing up with a war just ended, families recovering, and everyone around you trying to forget the bad bits. But what I do remember, vividly, is the feeling of the ball at my feet, how it gave me a sense of control, something I could own. My father, Dickie Best, was a humble man. He worked down at the shipyards, like most men in Belfast at the time, long shifts, hard labor. I could always see the strain in his eyes, but he never once complained. My mother, Anne, was different. She had a lightness about her, a sparkle that made her seem out of place in such a grim, hard-working city. I loved her for it. She gave me my first football, a scrappy thing barely bigger than a grapefruit, but that was enough. I must have been 5 or 6, and I was inseparable from it. Every day after school, I'd rush out to the small patch of grass behind our council house in the Craigac estate, kicking that ball against the rough brick wall. The wall was my first teammate. It always gave the ball back, but never in the same way. The uneven bricks meant the ball could ricochet off at any angle, and soon, I learned to react instinctively. It sharpened my reflexes, taught me how to control the ball even when I didn't know what it would do next. Football became my sanctuary, my escape from the reality of Belfast. Belfast in the 1950s wasn't a place you'd think would produce someone like me. It was grimy, full of sectarian tension, and as a young Catholic lad, I was always on edge. There was always something brewing just under the surface. But on that patch of grass with my scruffy football, none of that mattered. The only thing I thought about was the ball, the joy it brought me. That, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, it would take me somewhere better. The turning point came when I was 11. That was when I started playing properly, with a local boys' team, Craigac Boys Club. I was small, too small, really. Even then, people couldn't help but point it out. But what I lacked in size, I made up for in speed and a natural feel for the game. I wasn't afraid to take on bigger lads, dribbling around them as if they were standing still. I learned early on that if you're quicker than everyone else, size doesn't matter. The ball was my equalizer, my weapon. It wasn't long before people started talking. Coaches, other kids, even their parents would say things like, "That Best lad's got something." I didn't care much for what they said. Not then, but I could tell my father was starting to believe I might be something special. He'd come to watch my games, standing quietly on the sidelines, just watching. He wasn't one for praise, not out loud, but when we walked home afterward, he'd give me a little pat on the back or squeeze my shoulder, which for him was like a standing ovation. Football in Northern Ireland, though, wasn't exactly a golden ticket. Not in those days. We had local heroes, but no one ever really expected a lad from Belfast to make it big on the mainland. That was for the English boys, or maybe the Scots. But Ireland? That was a long shot. Still, I kept playing, mostly because I didn't know what else I wanted. School never interested me, and I knew that life in the shipyards wasn't for me either. I wasn't built for it. Then came the letter. I was 15. I remember the moment so clearly. My mother stood at the kitchen table with an envelope in her hands. It had the Manchester United crest on it. I knew what it meant straight away. My heart pounded, but I played it cool as I tore it open. I still remember the words. They wanted me to come for a trial. My hands shook as I held the letter, the excitement barely contained. My father, of course, said nothing, but I could see the pride in his eyes. This was a chance, a real chance to get out of Belfast, to make something of myself. The day I left for Manchester, I wasn't nervous. That might sound strange, but I was just too focused, too eager. I'd heard of Busby's Babes, the young, talented players who were taking England by storm under the legendary Matt Busby. I thought maybe, just maybe, I could be one of them. I arrived at Old Trafford, and it was like stepping into a different world. The stadium itself, even though it was empty that day, felt like a cathedral. The pitch was like a carpet compared to the rough patches of grass I'd been used to back home. Everything seemed bigger, grander. The trial itself didn't go as smoothly as I'd hoped. I was nervous, no doubt about it. I didn't have the confidence I'd built back in Belfast, playing against the lads I knew. Here, everything was different. The other boys seemed stronger, faster, more experienced. For the first time, I felt out of my depth. But still, there were moments, flashes, I suppose, when I'd pull off something special. A quick turn, a neat pass, a little dribble. But I wasn't sure it was enough. After the trial, I went back to Belfast, unsure of what would happen next. Weeks passed, and I started to wonder if it was all a dream, just a nice story to tell the lads at school. But then, the second letter came. This time, it wasn't just an invitation. It was an offer. They wanted me to sign with United. When I told my parents, my mother cried, but not out of sadness. They both knew what this meant, but it wasn't going to be easy. At 15, I'd be leaving home, leaving everything behind to move to England. In those days, that was no small thing. But I didn't hesitate. Football was my life now, and Manchester United was the only place I wanted to be. I packed my bags and set off for Manchester. The club put me up in digs, living with a local family near Old Trafford. I was homesick at first, no doubt about it. The rain, the grey skies, even the way people spoke felt foreign to me. But I threw myself into training, determined to make an impression. At first, the coaches didn't quite know what to make of me. I was small, maybe too small for their liking, but there was something about my game they couldn't ignore. I had this natural ability to glide past defenders, a knack for making the ball stick to my feet. Slowly but surely, I started to make a name for myself in the youth team. Word got around that there was this skinny kid from Belfast who could play like no one else. I'll never forget the day I met Matt Busby. He had this aura about him, this calm authority that made you want to do anything to impress him. I was 17 when he first called me into his office. I was nervous, no doubt about it. He sat behind his desk, looked me up and down, and said, "You've got something, son. Keep working hard, and you'll go far." That was it. Just a few words, but coming from him, it was like a blessing. Not long after, I made my debut for the first team. It was a cold December afternoon, and we were playing West Brom. I was terrified, to be honest. The crowd at Old Trafford was massive, and for the first time, I realized just how big a club Manchester United was. But once I stepped onto the pitch, something changed. All the nerves disappeared. It was just me, the ball, and the game I loved. We won 1-0, and while I didn't score, I held my own. I belonged. After that, things moved quickly. Suddenly, I was in the team more often than not, playing alongside some of the biggest names in football. Bobby Charlton, Dennis Law, they were legends in the making, and here I was, a kid from Belfast, sharing the same pitch. But I didn't feel out of place. The more I played, the more I realized I had something special. The press started calling me the fifth Beatle because of my looks and the way I played. Girls started showing up at training just to watch me, and I'd get recognized on the streets. I was only 20, but I was already becoming a superstar. Looking back, I can see how that might have gone to my head, but at the time, I didn't care. I was just having fun, living the dream, but with fame came pressure. Manchester United was a club that demanded success, and as one of the rising stars, I was expected to deliver. Some days, it felt like the whole world was watching me. I'd walk down the streets of Manchester, and people would stop me, asking for autographs, wanting a piece of me. At first, it was flattering, but soon, it became overwhelming. The 1967-68 season was a turning point. That was the year we won the European Cup. It was the pinnacle of my career, the moment when everything seemed to come together. We beat Benfica 4-1 in the final, and I scored one of the goals. It was a magical night, the kind you dream about as a kid, but never really think will happen. Winning the European Cup in 1968 was, for most of us at Manchester United, the ultimate achievement. We were the first English team to win it, and it felt like we were on top of the world. That night in Lisbon was surreal, a night where everything clicked. Bobby Charlton was magnificent, as he always was. and my goal. It felt like everything slowed down as I rounded the keeper and slid the ball into the net. I wasn't even celebrating right away. I was just taking it all in. The roar from our supporters, the flashbulbs popping from the stands. It's something I'll never forget. But that was the peak, and when you're at the top, the only way is down. After Lisbon, things changed. Success like that brings expectations, and the more you win, the more people expect you to win again. But it's not as simple as that. The game, football, it's unpredictable. One minute you're untouchable, the next, you can't do anything right. That's how it felt for me. For a while, it seemed like I could do no wrong. Everything I touched turned to gold. I was scoring goals, dazzling defenders, and the world loved me for it. I'd go out in Manchester, and people would swarm me. Clubs were offering me money just to show up for an hour. I'd leave a nightclub, and there'd be a line of photographers waiting outside. It wasn't just football anymore, I was a celebrity. But the problem with fame is that it's addictive. I'd always loved attention, sure, but now I was getting it everywhere. There were girls, there were parties. There was money. So much money. And I didn't have a clue what to do with it all. I was a kid from Belfast who'd never had anything, and now I had everything. At first, it was just fun. I'd go out with the lads after a match, a few drinks here and there. Nothing serious. But then, the nights out started getting later, and the mornings started getting harder. I'd still show up to training, but I wasn't as sharp as I used to be. The coaches noticed, the press noticed, and eventually, Matt Busby noticed. Busby was like a father to me. He'd always believed in me, even when others doubted. But after the European Cup, he seemed to know something was wrong before I did. He pulled me aside one day after training. His calm Scottish voice cutting through the usual banter in the dressing room. "George, lad, you've got to be careful," he said. "This game, it'll give you everything you want, but it'll take it all away just as fast." I nodded, of course, but in my head, I was thinking, "Not me. I'm George Best. I can handle it." I couldn't have been more wrong. The next couple of seasons after Lisbon were a mixed bag. On the one hand, I was still playing well, better than well, some might say. I was scoring goals, making defenders look foolish, and the fans adored me. But there was a growing restlessness inside me. I'd achieved everything I'd ever dreamed of, and yet I wasn't satisfied. The more success I had, the more empty I felt. I started going out more, drinking more. There was always a party to go to, always someone wanting to buy me a drink. And I wasn't saying no. Football was still important to me, but it wasn't the only thing in my life anymore. And that was dangerous. It's one thing to have distractions, it's another to let them take over. I'd show up at training with a hangover, barely able to focus. My fitness started to slip, and while I was still scoring, I wasn't the player I had been. I could feel it. There were moments of brilliance, but they were becoming fewer and farther between. And the press, well, they're vultures. They started writing about my lifestyle, about the girls, the drinking. They'd catch me coming out of a nightclub at 3 a.m. and plaster it across the back pages the next morning. Busby tried to rein me in, but by then, I was too far gone. I'd show up late to training, or sometimes not at all. I didn't care. I thought I was invincible, that I could keep living like that and still be the best player in the world. But football doesn't work that way. In 1970, things started to unravel. Manchester United wasn't the same team anymore. We weren't winning like we used to, and the cracks were starting to show. Matt Busby had retired the year before, and his replacement, Wilf McGuinness, was struggling. The team wasn't clicking, and my own form was inconsistent. Some games, I'd play like the old George Best, scoring goals, dazzling the crowd. Other games, I was a shadow of myself, barely able to keep up with the pace. The fans started to turn. One minute, they were cheering my name, the next, they were booing me off the pitch. It was like they could sense I wasn't giving my all anymore, and they were right. I wasn't. I was distracted, caught up in the celebrity lifestyle, and football was suffering because of it. I tried to get my head straight, to focus on the game again. But it wasn't easy. There were always temptations, always someone offering me a way out, a distraction. And I wasn't strong enough to resist. The drinking got worse, the nights out longer. It wasn't just affecting my football anymore, it was affecting my life. I'd wake up in the morning, look at myself in the mirror, and wonder what had happened. How had I gone from being the golden boy of Manchester United, the greatest player in the world, to this? But I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that I was lost. In 1971. The club had enough. They suspended me for going AWOL, just disappeared, didn't show up for training, didn't even call. I didn't care. I thought they'd let me back in, that they needed me too much to let me go. And for a while they did. But my relationship with the club was strained, and it was clear to everyone that I wasn't the same player I had been. In my mind, though, I still believed I was George Best, the genius, the superstar. But football isn't kind to those who think they're bigger than the game. It humbles you, whether you like it or not. 1972 was the year everything really fell apart. I'd been in and out of the team, my form was erratic, and the drinking had taken over. I'd sit in the dressing room before a match, and I couldn't even concentrate. My mind was elsewhere. I didn't care about winning anymore. I just wanted to get through the game and go back to the pub. And then, the final straw. I walked out. Just left the club. No explanation, no warning. I didn't care about the consequences. In my head, I was done. The press went wild, of course. Headlines everywhere. Best walks out on United. They loved it. And honestly, at that point, so did I. I didn't want to play anymore, not like that. Not under the pressure, not with everyone watching my every move. I needed space, needed to get away. But it didn't take long before I regretted it. Football had been my life, my identity, and without it, I felt lost. I tried to make a comeback, to get back in shape, but it was too late. The drinking had taken its toll, my body wasn't the same, and mentally, I wasn't there anymore. United let me go in 1974. It was the end of an era, not just for me, but for the club. We'd been through so much together, from the European Cup triumph to the dark days of the early 70s. But it was over. I drifted after that, played for a few other clubs, but it was never the same. I was chasing something I'd lost, trying to recapture the magic of my youth, but it wasn't there anymore. And that's the thing about football. It gives you everything, but once it's gone, you're left with nothing. I'd sit in my flat, nursing a drink, watching matches on the telly, and wonder what could have been. If I'd just stayed focused, if I'd stayed away from the booze, maybe things would have been different. But life doesn't work like that. You don't get to go back. Looking back now, I can see the mistakes I made, the opportunities one wasted. But at the time, I was just living fast, playing hard, and trying to keep up with the image the world had of me. I was George Best, after all. The greatest. Or at least, I used to be. After I left Manchester United in 1974, it felt like the world had turned upside down. I thought I'd made the decision, but in truth, the decision was made for me. United was my home for over a decade, the place where I'd grown from a skinny Belfast lad into a footballing icon. Walking away from it, though, felt like stepping into a void, a dark emptiness where the spotlight had suddenly shifted away. I wasn't ready for what came next. You don't think about these things when you're young, when you're on top of the world. There's always another game, another season. But once the game spits you out, once you're no longer useful on the pitch, reality starts creeping in. The funny thing is, I still felt like I could play, still believed I was George Best, the same player who could run rings around defenders. In my head, I was still untouchable, but my body was telling me something different. I tried to stay busy, tried to keep my head straight, but there were days when the regret gnawed at me. The club had been patient for as long as they could, but I had tested them one too many times. And now, here I was, drifting from place to place, club to club, trying to find something, anything that felt like the magic I'd known at Old Trafford. After leaving United, I signed with several teams, most of them far off from the glamour and prestige of the top-tier football I'd been accustomed to. Stockport County was my first stop. That's right, Stockport. From Old Trafford to Edgeley Park in the 4th Division. The contrast couldn't have been more stark, but I convinced myself it would just be a short stint, a bit of fun, a way to keep playing while I figured out my next move. It didn't last long. Nothing did during that time. The hunger, the drive, it was gone. I'd show up to training, run through the drills, go through the motions, but it didn't mean anything. The fans still came to see me play, to catch a glimpse of the old George Best, but I knew in my heart that I wasn't the same. I kept searching though, kept moving from team to team. Fulham came next, and for a brief moment, I thought maybe I'd found a spark again. I was playing alongside Bobby Moore, a World Cup winner, and the idea of two legends of the game gracing the same field at the twilight of our careers had an appeal. We were past our prime, but we had our moments. It was a strange kind of revival, if only temporary. The problem, though, was always the same: the drinking. You see, by then, the booze had a grip on me that I couldn't shake. I'd been drinking for years, but it wasn't until I left United that it became my crutch. It filled the emptiness that football used to fill. I'd wake up in the morning, not thinking about training or matches, but thinking about my next drink. It was never supposed to be like that. I'd always had fun with it, boozing, going out, the parties, but now it wasn't fun anymore. It was a necessity. At Fulham, I was still good enough to get by on natural ability. I'd have flashes of brilliance in training, moments where I'd feel like my old self again. But it didn't last. I was no longer fit, no longer sharp. And worse than that, I didn't care. I'd finish a game, head straight to the pub, and lose myself in the bottle. The fans still cheered for me, but I could see the disappointment in their eyes. They wanted me to be the old George Best, the one who danced through defenders and scored impossible goals. But I wasn't that player anymore, and I knew it. After Fulham, the wandering continued. I went to America, of all places, to play for the Los Angeles Aztecs in the North American Soccer League. People back home thought I was mad. Football? In America? It didn't seem right. But the offer was good, the money was decent, and frankly, I needed a change of scenery. Maybe I thought I could outrun my problems by crossing the Atlantic. America was a strange place for football, or soccer, as they insisted on calling it. The fans didn't really understand the game, not like they did in England or even back home in Belfast. But they knew who I was, and they came to watch. I was the big name, the star attraction. It was almost like a circus at times. The pitch was too narrow, the stadiums were half full, and I was playing alongside guys who never played football at any real level. But for a little while, it was fun. California had a way of numbing the pain. The sun, the beaches, the Hollywood parties. It was a long way from the rainy streets of Manchester. I'd sit by the pool, cocktail in hand, and pretend that I was happy. But deep down, I knew I was running away. From the football, from my past, from myself. After a season in Los Angeles, I bounced around again. San Jose, Fort Lauderdale, even a brief stint in Detroit. Everywhere I went, people treated me like a king, like the legend they remembered from the glory days of Manchester United. But inside, I was falling apart. I was drinking more than ever, staying out all night, barely making it to training. My performances on the pitch were inconsistent at best, abysmal at worst. And yet, somehow, people kept giving me chances. The truth is, I didn't know how to stop. Football had been my life for so long. And now that I wasn't playing at the top level anymore, I didn't know who I was without it. The booze filled the void, but it wasn't enough. Nothing was. I came back to England for a brief spell, playing for smaller clubs like Hibernian in Scotland and Bournemouth on the south coast. But it was never more than a stopgap, a way to keep playing for the sake of playing. My heart wasn't in it anymore, and it showed. I wasn't the George Best people remembered, but I couldn't let go of the game. It was all I knew. By the late 1970s, it was clear to everyone, including me, that my career was winding down. I didn't want to admit it, but I couldn't escape the truth. My body couldn't keep up anymore. The late nights, the drinking, the years of wear and tear had finally caught up with me. I was only 33, but I felt like an old man. Looking back, it's hard to say when exactly the magic disappeared. Maybe it was when I left United, or maybe it was even earlier. Maybe it was lost in those late-night clubs in Manchester, in the bottles of whiskey and champagne, in the endless parade of distractions. I don't know. All I know is that somewhere along the way, I lost the joy I used to feel when I had the ball at my feet. The 1980s were a blur of failed comebacks, broken promises, and too many drinks to count. I tried to get my life back on track, tried to find some semblance of order in the chaos I'd created. But it wasn't easy. The press hounded me wherever I went, eager to catch the latest scandal, the latest fall from grace. I became a caricature, a cautionary tale. George Best, the wasted talent. It was a label that stuck, and for years, I didn't do much to shake it off. But deep down, I never lost my love for the game. Even when I was at my lowest, I'd still watch matches, still find myself drawn to the beautiful simplicity of football. I'd sit in front of the telly, watching some young lad tear down the wing, and for a moment, I'd forget everything else. I'd forget the drinking, the mistakes, the regrets. All that mattered was the game. I tried to clean myself up more than once, tried to get sober, to live a normal life. But it was hard. Football had given me everything, but it had also taken everything. It's a cruel game like that. When you're on top, it feels like the world will never stop cheering your name. But when you're no longer useful, no longer the best, it moves on without you. I don't blame the game for what happened to me. I made my choices, and I live with them. But there's a part of me that will always wonder what might have been. If I'd stayed at United, if I'd kept my focus, if I'd turned down that drink, or left that party a little earlier. But life isn't made of what-ifs. It's made of choices, and I made mine. There was one moment, though, that gave me a bit of hope. It was in 1984, during a brief return to Bournemouth. I was well past my prime by then, but I remember walking out onto the pitch for the first time in months. The crowd was small, nothing like Old Trafford, but as I walked out, they started chanting my name. George Best, George Best. For a second, it felt like the old days, like I was back at the theater of dreams, with the ball at my feet and the world watching. And in those moments, the bottle was always there, whispering in my ear, offering comfort in a way nothing else could. I went back to the drink. I told myself it would just be a glass or two, just to take the edge off. But it never stopped there. It never does. Before long, I was back where I started, drinking myself into oblivion, hiding from the world, from myself. My marriage fell apart. My wife, Angie, had been patient, far more patient than I deserved, but even she couldn't stick around forever. I don't blame her. Living with me couldn't have been easy. I was unreliable, distant, more interested in chasing my next drink than in being a husband. We divorced in 1986, and the papers had a field day with it. George Best, fallen icon. They loved to write me off, to paint me as a tragic figure, the footballing genius who wasted his talent and his life. It hurt, reading those headlines. I knew I'd made mistakes, but seeing it all laid out like that, seeing my name dragged through the mud, it was hard to take. But what could I do? I'd given them the ammunition. I tried to focus on my punditry work, but even that began to slip. There were a few occasions when I showed up to the studio still drunk from the night before. The producers were kind enough to look the other way, but I knew I couldn't keep that up. I wasn't fooling anyone. It was around this time that my old friend Bobby Charlton reached out to me. Bobby had always been a steady influence, a calm voice amid the chaos. We'd been through so much together at United, and despite everything, he still cared about me. He invited me out to dinner one evening, just the two of us. I think he knew what I was going through, even if I hadn't admitted it to myself yet. We sat there in this quiet little restaurant, the kind of place where nobody bothered us, and Bobby just looked at me. Really looked at me. He didn't say anything for a while, and then, in that calm, understated way of his, he said, "George, you're better than this. You know you are." I didn't respond right away. I just stared down at my drink, swirling the whiskey around in the glass. Bobby didn't push. He never did. He just let the words hang there, like a lifeline waiting to be grabbed. "I don't know if I am," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. Bobby sighed, and for the first time, I saw the sadness in his eyes. "You've still got time," he said. "It's never too late." I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to. But there was a part of me, a deep, cynical part, that wasn't sure if I could climb out of the hole I'd dug for myself. I'd spent so many years self-destructing, burning bridges, pushing people away. Could I really change? Could I really be the man Bobby believed I could be? I left that dinner feeling conflicted. On the one hand, I knew Bobby was right. I couldn't keep living like this. But on the other hand, the path ahead felt so daunting, so uncertain. And in the back of my mind, there was always that nagging voice, the one that told me I wasn't worth saving, that I'd already wasted my chance. A few months after that dinner, in the late 1980s, my health took another hit. My liver was in worse shape than ever, and the doctors made it clear that if I didn't quit drinking, I was going to die. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was a fact. I checked myself into rehab again, this time with a renewed sense of determination. I'd hit rock bottom, and I knew that if I didn't change now, there wouldn't be another chance. I went through the process, endured the withdrawals, and came out the other side feeling different. Lighter maybe, more in control. For a while, I managed to stay sober. I started doing charity work, speaking at events, trying to use my story as a way to help others avoid the mistakes I'd made. I was invited to football academies to talk to young players, to share my experiences. I didn't sugarcoat anything. I told them the truth, the highs, the lows, and everything in between. And I could see it in their faces, the awe, the admiration, but also the fear. Fear that they might end up like me if they weren't careful. I wanted to be a better man. I really did. But as always, the demons were never far away. The pressure, the loneliness, the constant battle to stay sober, it wore me down. And then, in a moment of weakness, I relapsed. It was the same story all over again. One drink turned into 2, then 3, then 10. I hated myself for it, but once I started, I couldn't stop. And this time, the consequences were even more severe. In 2002, I had to undergo a liver transplant. The years of drinking had done so much damage that my liver was beyond saving. The operation was a success, and for a time, I thought maybe this was it, the final wake-up call. Maybe now, after all these years, I could finally put the bottle down for good. The liver transplant was a chance, a real one, a lifeline when I least deserved it. A new beginning, as the doctors told me. I remember lying in the hospital bed afterward, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that this was the moment I'd finally turned things around. The surgery had saved my life. The donor had given me the gift of more time I'd wasted so freely before. How could I not change now? The papers were all over it, of course. Best gets new life. And football genius saved by miracle surgery. They painted it as a redemption story, as if a new liver would suddenly fix all my problems. They wanted to believe I'd be the George Best from back in the day, the young, fresh-faced boy with limitless potential. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Changing your body was one thing, but changing your mind, your habits, your instincts, that was something else entirely. For a while though, I tried. I did. The surgery had taken a toll on my body, and I wasn't in any shape to be partying. Recovery forced me to slow down, to rest. I stayed away from the drink, and the press called it a miracle. People wanted to believe I was getting better, and I wanted to believe it too. But sobriety was like walking a tightrope. Every day was a balancing act, trying to keep myself from tipping over into old habits. The thing no one tells you about addiction is that it never really goes away. It lurks in the back of your mind, always there, always waiting for a moment of weakness. It wasn't long before the invitations started pouring in again. Appearances, charity matches, interviews. Everyone wanted to hear from me, to see me, to put me on display like some relic of a glorious past. I still had my charm, still knew how to put on a good show, and people ate it up. But every time I walked into a room, every time I faced the cameras, I could feel the weight of my own history pressing down on me. They weren't looking at George Best, the man who'd been through hell and back. They were looking at George Best, the legend, the myth. They wanted the best from 1968, the footballer who could do no wrong. They didn't want the reality, the broken man who was barely hanging on. Angie, my ex-wife, had moved on by then. She was happy, and I couldn't begrudge her that. She deserved better than what I'd given her. But still, it was hard to see her getting on with her life while I felt stuck, trapped in this never-ending cycle of highs and lows. I had a son, Callum, and I wanted to be a good father to him, but I was always more of a ghost in his life than a real presence. He lived with Angie, and though I tried to stay in touch, I knew I'd let him down more times than I could count. It wasn't fair to him. He didn't deserve that. But addiction isn't fair, and I hadn't yet figured out how to be the father he needed. The invitations kept coming, and soon, the temptation to drink returned with them. I'd go to these events, standing there with a glass of water or soda in my hand, trying to ignore the people around me with their champagne and cocktails. But it was always there, that little voice in my head. Just one drink, George. Just one. You can handle it. The trouble is, I couldn't handle it. Not then, not ever. I was never the kind of man who could have just one drink. One always turned into two, two into 10, and before I knew it, I was right back where I started. That's what people don't understand about addiction. It's not about willpower. It's not about strength or weakness. It's a fight with your own brain, and sometimes it wins. I started drinking again. Quietly, at first. I told myself I could control it this time, that I wouldn't let it spiral like it had before. But of course, I couldn't control it. I never could. The drink became a crutch again, helping me get through the long, lonely nights, the weight of my past pressing down on me. I'd have a few drinks to take the edge off, to silence the noise in my head, but soon enough, it was the same story all over again. The papers got wind of it eventually. They always do. Best back on the bottle, splashed across the tabloids, as if they were waiting for me to fall. They loved the tragedy of it, the drama. It sold papers, after all. The public ate it up, the rise and fall of George Best, the footballing god turned mortal. I hated it, hated how they turned my pain into entertainment, but what could I do? I'd given them the story. I was the one who'd stumbled, who'd picked up the bottle again, who couldn't outrun his demons. It was around this time that I started losing people. My old mates, the ones who'd stuck by me for years, started drifting away. Some of them couldn't bear to watch me destroy myself any longer. I don't blame them. Watching someone you care about go down that road again and again, it wears you out. Even Bobby, my old friend from United, started keeping his distance. He never said it outright, but I could tell. He couldn't stand to see me like this, couldn't stand to see what I'd become. I was losing everyone, but worst of all, I was losing myself. I remember one night in particular. I was sitting in my flat, alone, with a bottle of whiskey by my side. I'd been drinking for hours, maybe even days. Time had a way of slipping away from me during those dark stretches. The television was on, but I wasn't really watching. It was just background noise, something to fill the silence. My head was swimming, my thoughts muddled, but there was one thing that kept repeating in my mind, over and over again. What had I done? I'd had it all, hadn't I? The world at my feet, the love of millions, a talent that most could only dream of. And I'd thrown it away. For what? For the drink? For the women? For the fleeting thrill of the nightlife that had consumed me? It didn't seem worth it anymore. None of it did. I thought about my son, about Callum. He deserved better than this, better than a father who couldn't keep himself together. I thought about Bobby, about how he tried to help me, how he told me I could still turn things around. And I thought about my younger self, that skinny kid from Belfast who had nothing but a dream and a football at his feet. Would he be proud of what I'd become? Would he even recognize me? I took another swig of whiskey, the burn of it sliding down my throat. It was comforting in a way, but it also felt like defeat. I knew I was in trouble. I knew I couldn't keep going like this, but the thought of stopping, of facing the mess I'd made of my life, felt impossible. The drink was easier. It always had been. The next morning, or maybe it was afternoon by then, I woke up with the familiar pounding in my head, the dry mouth, the nausea. Another hangover, just like 1,000 before it. But something was different this time. As I sat there, head in my hands, staring at the empty bottle on the floor, I felt done. Finished. I didn't want to keep living like this. I couldn't. I picked up the phone and called Angie. She didn't answer at first. Why would she? We hadn't spoken in months, and every time we did, it ended with her telling me I needed help, and me brushing it off like it wasn't that bad. But this time, I left a message. I need help. That was it. Just 3 words. I didn't know what else to say. I didn't know if she'd even call me back. But I meant it. For the first time in a long time, I really meant it. A few hours later, the phone rang. It was Angie. She didn't say much, just told me she'd arrange for someone to come get me. She didn't sound angry, didn't sound judgmental. Just tired. Tired of me, tired of the whole damn situation. I couldn't blame her. The next day, I checked myself into rehab again. It wasn't my first time, and I'm ashamed to say it wouldn't be my last, but something about this time felt different. Maybe it was the transplant, the knowledge that I'd been given a second chance and was squandering it. Maybe it was the realization that I was running out of chances altogether. I don't know. But I was determined to try, to really try. The road to recovery was long, and it wasn't straight. There were bumps, relapses, moments when I thought I'd never make it out. But there were also moments of clarity, moments when I felt like I was finally starting to understand myself, to understand why I'd made the choices I had. Football had given me everything, but it had also taken everything. It was a double-edged sword, and I'd been cut by it more times than I could count. As I worked through my recovery, I started thinking about my life, about all the things I'd done, both good and bad. The goals, the trophies, the nights out, the headlines, it all seemed like someone else's life. When I thought back to my glory days at Manchester United, lifting the European Cup at Wembley, the adoration of the crowd as I danced past defenders with the ball glued to my feet, it felt like I was watching a film, like the George Best in those memories wasn't the same man sitting in that rehab center, trying to piece his life back together. But that was the thing. I was both of those men. The genius on the pitch and the mess off it. I tried for years to separate those two halves of myself, to pretend that the George Best who lit up Old Trafford was somehow different from the George Best who drowned himself in alcohol every night. But that was the lie I told myself. Football had been the one place where I could forget everything, where I didn't have to face the pain, the insecurity, the feeling that maybe I wasn't as great as everyone thought. But when the final whistle blew, when the fans went home, and the floodlights dimmed, I was just me. And I didn't know who that was anymore. In rehab, they talk about confronting your demons, about digging into the parts of yourself you've been trying to avoid for so long. It's not easy. Hell, it's the hardest thing I've ever done. But there's no other way. You can't heal without facing the truth, and the truth was, I'd been running from myself for years. Football had given me a way to escape, but without it, I was lost. That was the real reason I drank. Not because of the fame or the pressure, though those things certainly didn't help, but because I didn't know how to live with myself when the spotlight wasn't on me. It wasn't something I could admit easily. I'd always had this image of myself as confident, as someone who could handle anything life threw at me. But deep down, there was always doubt, always this fear that I wasn't enough. And the more people idolized me, the more I felt like a fraud. How could I live up to that image? How could I ever be the man they wanted me to be when I didn't even know who I was? The more I talked about it, though, the more I realized I wasn't alone. Addiction does that to people. It isolates you, makes you feel like you're the only one struggling, the only one who's failed. But sitting there in group therapy, listening to the others talk about their own battles, I realized that we were all fighting the same demons. The details might have been different, but the pain, the guilt, the shame, that was all the same. I remember one day, after a particularly tough session, I went back to my room and sat by the window, watching the rain trickle down the glass. I thought about Belfast, about the boy I used to be, kicking a ball around in the streets, dreaming of playing for Manchester United. That boy had no idea what was coming. He didn't know about the fame, the money, the women. He didn't know about the darkness that would follow. All he knew was the joy of the game, the pure, unfiltered love of football. Somewhere along the way, I'd lost that. I think that's what hurt the most, losing that joy. For so many years, football had been my escape, my salvation. But when it became my job, when it became something I was expected to excel at, it changed. The joy got buried under the weight of expectation, under the pressure to always be the best. And when I couldn't live up to that, when I started making mistakes on and off the pitch, the joy disappeared altogether. That was something I talked about a lot in therapy, how I tied my entire identity to football. It wasn't just what I did, it was who I was. And when football wasn't there anymore, when my career began to wind down, I didn't know who I was without it. I was just George, the man behind the myth, and I didn't like what I saw. Rehab gave me time to think about all of that, to dig into those feelings I'd been pushing away for years. It wasn't just about getting sober, it was about understanding why I'd ended up here in the first place. And as much as I wanted to blame the drink, or the fame, or the people around me, I knew that the real problem was me. I was the one who hadn't dealt with my issues. I was the one who'd let the pressure and the expectations swallow me whole. It wasn't an easy pill to swallow. I'd spent so many years running away from responsibility, from the consequences of my actions, that facing them now felt like a mountain I couldn't climb. But there was something freeing about it too, about finally being honest with myself. I messed up, no point denying that. But I still had time, maybe not to fix everything, but to at least make peace with it. To stop running and face whatever was left of my life head on. After a few months in rehab, I started to feel like I could breathe again, like I could see a way forward. It wasn't going to be easy, staying sober never is. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a shot. I wasn't deluding myself into thinking I'd never touch a drink again, but I was ready to try. Ready to do the work. When I finally left the rehab center, the world outside felt strange. Nothing had changed, not really, but I had. And I wasn't sure where to go from here. The thought of returning to the old places, the old faces, made me uneasy. I knew how easy it would be to slip back into old habits, to fall in with the same crowd, to pick up a glass and tell myself it would be just the one. I couldn't afford that. I had to do things differently this time. I kept my distance from the old haunts, from the people who only wanted me around for the stories and the headlines. Instead, I threw myself into projects that felt meaningful. I started working with charities, especially those that dealt with alcoholism and addiction. It wasn't easy, talking about my past in front of rooms full of strangers, but if my story could help even one person avoid the path I'd gone down, then it was worth it. Callum came to visit me more often now. He was growing up fast, and I realized how much I'd missed, how much time I'd lost to the drink. I wanted to be better for him, to be the kind of father he could look up to, even if it was too late to undo the mistakes of the past. We started to rebuild our relationship, slowly, awkwardly at first, but it was a start. He didn't say much about the years I'd been absent, but I could see the questions in his eyes. I knew he'd forgiven me for some things, but there were wounds that would take longer to heal, if they ever did. One night, we were sitting in my flat, watching an old Manchester United match on TV. It was a replay of a game from the early 70s, one of the last great performances I'd put in before everything started to unravel. I watched myself on the screen, darting past defenders, scoring a beauty from outside the box, and I saw the look on Callum's face. He'd heard the stories, of course, everyone had, but I think this was the first time he really saw what all the fuss had been about. "You were brilliant," he said quietly, almost to himself. I smiled, but there was a sadness in it too. I was, for a while. He turned to me, his brow furrowed, like he couldn't quite reconcile the man sitting beside him with the one flying across the screen. "Why did you stop?" I didn't know how to answer that. How could I explain to him, to anyone, why I'd thrown it all away? Why I'd let the drink, the fame, the pressure get the better of me? There wasn't a simple answer, and even if there was, I wasn't sure he'd understand. "I don't know," I said, after a long pause. "I just lost my way." He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't satisfied with that answer. And maybe that was because there wasn't a satisfying answer. Maybe there never would be. That night, after Callum had gone to bed, I sat by myself, replaying the game in my mind. The goals, the passes, the moments of brilliance that had once come so easily to me. They felt like a lifetime ago, like they belonged to someone else. And in a way, they did. The George Best on that screen wasn't the same man who was sitting here now. He was gone, lost to time and mistakes and regret. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to drown those feelings in alcohol. I didn't feel the pull of the bottle, didn't feel the urge to escape. Instead, I let myself sit with the sadness, with the grief for the career and the life I could have had. It wasn't pleasant, but it was real. And that, I realized, was the only way forward, to face the truth, to live with it, and to keep going. In the years that followed, I stayed sober more often than not. There were still slip-ups, moments of weakness when the old habits resurfaced, but I didn't let them define me anymore. I was more than my mistakes. I had to believe that. If I didn't, there was no point in carrying on. Football was still there, in the background, like a shadow of my past that never quite left me. I'd watch the matches on television, sometimes in pubs, surrounded by fans who still remembered me as George Best, the legend, the genius, the man who lit up the pitch like no one else. But the more I watched, the more I felt the distance between that man and the one I had become. It was a strange feeling, sitting among those who idolized me for something I could no longer do. They talked about my goals, my dribbles, my audacity, as though I were still that boy with endless possibilities. But that boy was long gone, replaced by a man trying to find his way in a world that no longer revolved around football. I couldn't shake the pull of the game entirely, though. It had been my life for too long, and despite everything, it was still the one thing that made sense to me. I started attending more matches, not as a player, but as a spectator, often sitting in the stands with fans who were too young to have seen me play in person. Some of them recognized me, of course, and asked for autographs or photos, but most just let me be. I liked it that way. I wasn't there for the attention. I was there to reconnect with the sport I'd fallen in love with all those years ago, the sport that had given me everything and taken just as much in return. One day, I found myself back at Old Trafford. It wasn't planned. I'd been invited to a charity event nearby, and on a whim, I decided to stop by the stadium. It had changed since my playing days, expanded, modernized, but the essence of it was still the same. Walking through the gates, I felt a wave of nostalgia wash over me, like I was stepping into a time machine, back to those days when I was king of this place. The memories came flooding back, the roars of the crowd, the smell of the grass, the thrill of the ball at my feet. I wandered through the corridors, past the trophy cabinets filled with silverware from the years after I'd left. United had gone on to win so much more after my time, and while I was proud of the club, part of me always wondered what might have been if I'd stuck around, if I'd managed to keep myself together long enough to be a part of those future glories. But regrets like that are a poison. I'd spent too many years dwelling on what could have been. Now I was just grateful to be here, to feel the connection to the game again, even if it was only as a spectator. I ended up sitting in one of the private boxes, a guest of some corporate sponsor I barely knew. They'd been kind enough to offer me a seat, but once the match started, I was alone with my thoughts. United were playing well, full of energy, full of life. The crowd was electric, and for a moment, I could almost feel that old fire inside me, the one that had driven me to be the best, the one that made me who I was. As I watched, I found myself studying the players closely, their movements, their decision-making. There was so much talent on the pitch, so much potential, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of envy. Not for their skills, those days were behind me, but for their youth, their ability to start fresh, to make their mark on the game without the weight of the past bearing down on them. They had everything ahead of them, and I hoped they wouldn't make the same mistakes I had. After the match, I was invited down to the locker room to meet some of the players. I hesitated at first. The idea of standing there, in the same room where I'd once sat as a young man, felt strange, like I didn't quite belong anymore. But curiosity got the better of me, and before I knew it, I was walking down the familiar tunnel, my heart pounding in my chest. The echoes of the past were everywhere. When I stepped into the locker room, the players greeted me with smiles and handshakes. Some of them were starstruck, which I found both flattering and uncomfortable. They were half my age, barely old enough to remember me in my prime, but they spoke about my career with the kind of reverence usually reserved for legends long gone. It was strange, being alive to witness my own myth. I wasn't sure what to say to them. What advice could I offer? Don't be like me. Seemed like the most honest thing I could say, but I kept it to myself. One of the younger players, a talented winger who reminded me a bit of myself in my early days, asked me about my time at the club. "What was it like back then, George?" he asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. I looked around the room, at the state-of-the-art facilities, the trainers and physiotherapists bustling about, the rows of perfectly tailored jerseys hanging neatly on the walls. "It was different," I said, smiling a little. "Not worse, just different. The game was simpler in some ways. We played for the love of it, mostly. The fame, the money, that all came later." He nodded, as if trying to imagine what that might have been like, playing in an era before social media, before every move was scrutinized by millions. I wondered if they knew how lucky they were, or if, like me, they'd only realize it once it was too late. Before I left, the manager pulled me aside for a quick word. He was a new face, someone I hadn't met before, but he spoke with respect, acknowledging what I'd meant to the club, to football. "The lads could learn a lot from you," he said, though I wasn't sure if he meant on the pitch or off it. I gave him a half smile. "Just tell them to enjoy it while it lasts." As I walked out of Old Trafford that day, I felt lighter somehow, as if I'd made peace with something that had been gnawing at me for years. I was no longer the boy wonder, no longer the best footballer in the world, but that was okay. I'd had my time, and now it was someone else's turn. In the months that followed, I threw myself into my work with the charities. It gave me a sense of purpose, something I'd sorely lacked for so long. I spoke at schools, at recovery centers, even at prisons, sharing my story with anyone who would listen. It wasn't easy, bearing my soul like that, but it was cathartic in a way. For the first time, I was using my experiences, my failures, my regrets, to help others. I met people who were going through the same struggles I had, people who felt like their lives were spiraling out of control. Some of them recognized me, some didn't. It didn't matter. What mattered was that they saw a man who had been where they were, who had walked through the fire and come out the other side, battered and bruised, but still standing. I wasn't a hero, far from it, but if my story could give them hope, then it was worth telling. One day, after a talk at a recovery center in Belfast, a young man approached me. He couldn't have been more than 20, but there was a weariness in his eyes that made him seem much older. He'd been through hell, I could tell that much just from looking at him. He told me he'd been struggling with addiction for years, that he'd lost everything, his job, his family, his friends. I didn't think anyone could understand, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. But then I heard you speak, and I realized maybe I'm not alone. I looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something like hope. Not just for him, but for myself too. Because maybe that was the point of all of this, the mistakes, the pain, the regret. Maybe it wasn't just about me anymore. Maybe my story, my life, could mean something to someone else, could help them find their way when they felt lost. You're not alone, I told him. None of us are. As I walked back to my flat that night, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for so long. I wasn't fixed, I wasn't perfect, but I was trying. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. The ghosts of my past were still there, of course, but they didn't haunt me the way they used to. They were part of me, part of my story, but they didn't define me anymore. I wasn't George Best, the legend, the myth, the man who could do no wrong on the football field. I was just George, a man trying to live the rest of his life as best as he could. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. There was still more work to be done, more battles to fight, but for the first time, I felt ready to face them. Ready to stop running, to stop hiding. Ready to live. The fight wasn't over yet. But I was still here, still standing. Still fighting. I thought about how strange it was, that fight to keep going when you'd already lived what felt like several lifetimes. There were days when I still felt like a kid kicking a ball around in Belfast, and others when I felt every year, every mistake, weighing heavy on my bones. But that was life, wasn't it? This constant push and pull between past and present, between what you've done and what you're still trying to do. There were days when it was harder than others. Staying sober, keeping up the appearances, convincing myself that everything I was doing mattered. Some mornings, I'd wake up and wonder if I could even bother getting out of bed. The urge to disappear, to go back to that dark place where no one expected anything of me, it never really went away. But each time, I reminded myself of the people who needed me, the young men and women who came to hear me speak, who saw in me some glimmer of hope that they could turn their lives around too. One afternoon, I was back in Belfast for another charity event. This one was different though. I was heading to a local youth football club, one of the few that still operated in the old part of the city where I'd grown up. It wasn't just about speaking to them this time. I was going to coach them for the day. It felt like a full circle, in a way. Walking through those streets again, past the old houses, the narrow lanes where I'd learned how to dribble past every obstacle life threw in front of me. It was like stepping back into my childhood. The club was small, nothing fancy, just a few fields of worn grass and a half-standing shed that served as the changing rooms. But it was alive with the sound of kids laughing, shouting, chasing the ball like it was the only thing in the world that mattered. Watching them brought back a flood of memories, the thrill, the freedom, the pure joy of the game before everything got complicated. As soon as I stepped onto the pitch, the kids crowded around, some shy, others bolder, asking if I really was George Best. Their coaches had told them who I was, but most of them hadn't even been born when I was playing. To them, I was just a name, a legend whispered about in stories by their dads and granddads. I smiled at their wide-eyed curiosity, feeling a strange mix of pride and sadness. I'm George, I said, kneeling down to their level. But today, I'm just here to play. The excitement in their eyes was contagious, and before long, we were out on the pitch, kicking the ball around. For a few hours, I forgot about everything else, the struggles, the past, the weight of my own mistakes. It was just me and the kids, running, laughing, playing football like it was meant to be played, with nothing on the line but the love of the game. One of the boys, maybe 10 or 11 years old, had something special. You could tell just by watching him move, the way he read the game instinctively, the way the ball seemed to follow his feet like it was part of him. He reminded me of myself at that age, restless, always pushing forward, always looking for the next move. I pulled him aside during a break, handing him a water bottle and giving him a pat on the shoulder. "You're good, lad," I told him. "Keep playing like that, and you'll go far." He grinned up at me, shy but proud. "You think I could play for United one day?" I felt a pang in my chest. It was the same dream I'd had at his age, the same fire that had pushed me out of Belfast and into the spotlight. "Anything's possible," I said, meaning it. "But remember, football's a gift. Don't let anything take the joy out of it." He nodded seriously, like he understood what I meant, though I wasn't sure he really did. How could he? He was just a boy, still full of hope, still unburdened by the pressures that would come if he made it to the top. Part of me wanted to shield him from all that, to tell him that there was more to life than football, that there were traps waiting for him off the pitch that he couldn't even imagine yet. But I didn't. It wasn't my place. I wasn't there to give him a lecture, just a bit of encouragement, just enough to keep his dream alive. After the session ended, the kids crowded around for autographs and photos. I signed shirts, boots, even a few arms, feeling a warmth that had been absent from my life for far too long. This was different from the old days, from the hysteria of being mobbed by fans in the street. These kids didn't care about my fame or my failures. To them, I was just someone who loved football as much as they did. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, I sat on one of the benches near the pitch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The quiet was nice, peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in years. My mind wandered back to that boy, the one with the big dreams. I wondered where he'd end up, if he'd make it to the top like he hoped, or if life would throw obstacles in his path, the way it had for so many others. As I sat there, I thought about how much the game had changed since my playing days. Football was bigger now, more commercialized, more about the business than the beauty of it. But in places like this, at grassroots level, the essence of the game was still alive. Here, on this scrappy little pitch in Belfast, kids were still playing for the love of it, for the pure joy that came from kicking a ball around with their mates. That was what I miss most about football, the simplicity of it, the freedom it gave me. For all the fame, for all the accolades, the happiest I'd ever been was when I was just a kid playing in the streets, with no one watching. No expectations, no pressure, just the ball and the joy it brought. As the days went by, I found myself drawn back to places like that more and more. Small football clubs, youth academies, anywhere that reminded me of the beginnings, of what football used to mean before it became a job. I wasn't looking for redemption, not really. I knew I couldn't undo the past, couldn't erase the mistakes I'd made. But maybe, in helping the next generation, I could make peace with the man I'd become. It was strange how life turned out. There was a time when I couldn't imagine anything beyond football, beyond the fame, the money, the thrill of the crowd. But now, here I was, finding more fulfillment in a quiet afternoon spent kicking a ball around with a group of kids than I ever did on the biggest stages in the world. One evening, after another long day spent with one of the youth clubs, I found myself back in my flat, flipping through an old scrapbook I hadn't looked at in years. It was filled with newspaper clippings, photographs, ticket stubs from games long since played. As I turned the pages, I saw my younger self staring back at me, grinning after another win, holding trophies high above my head, surrounded by adoring fans. It all felt so distant, like it had happened to someone else. And in a way, it had. That version of George Best, the one the world fell in love with, was long gone. He had lived his life in the spotlight, had burned brightly, and then faded. What was left was just me, older, wiser maybe, but still learning, still trying to find my way. I came across a photo from that night in 1968, after we'd won the European Cup. I was standing there with the trophy, a wide grin on my face, full of life, full of promise. I stared at it for a long time, remembering the joy, the sense of achievement, the feeling that anything was possible. But I also remembered what came after, the fall, the struggles, the darkness that had followed me for so many years. As I looked at that photo, I realized something. For the longest time, I'd been chasing that version of myself, trying to get back to the man I was when everything was perfect. But I wasn't that man anymore, and that was okay. I didn't need to be. What mattered now was who I was today, and what I could still do with the time I had left. Time moved differently these days. The wild pace of my youth had slowed to a gentle hum, and the days no longer slipped through my fingers like they once had. I'd find myself waking up early, sometimes before the sun, just sitting with a cup of tea and watching the city come to life. Belfast had changed so much over the years. The scars of the troubles were still there if you knew where to look, but it was a different place now, filled with a sense of hope I didn't recognize from my childhood. I wasn't sure if it was the city that had changed or if it was just me. Life had become more about reflection, about finding peace with everything that had happened, not just in football, but in all the years afterward. My days were filled with small routines, visits to local pitches, charity events, talks at schools or rehab centers. I still had the occasional media appearance, but I kept my distance from the spotlight for the most part. I didn't crave it anymore. The world didn't seem to need me like it once had, and I was fine with that. One afternoon, I received a call from an old teammate, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. He was organizing a testimonial match for charity, and he wanted me to play. I hadn't kicked a ball in any kind of serious way for what felt like forever, but the idea appealed to me, if only because it would give me a chance to reunite with the old gang, the ones who had been there for the highs and the lows, the ones who knew me before the world did. The match was set to take place at Windsor Park, back in Belfast. It felt fitting somehow. The idea of putting on a kit again, even for just a few minutes, stirred something in me. I couldn't deny that the thought of stepping onto the pitch in front of a crowd, even if it wasn't a stadium full of thousands, made my heart race just a little faster. When the day came, I arrived at the stadium feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. The stands weren't full, but there were enough people to create a buzz, and it reminded me of the old days. The air was crisp, and the grass was freshly cut. As I walked through the tunnel, I could hear the familiar hum of the crowd, the sound of kids kicking a ball around in the streets just outside the stadium. It felt like stepping back in time. In the dressing room, I saw familiar faces, old teammates who had aged as I had, their bodies a little slower, but their spirits just as lively. We laughed, told stories about the good old days, and ribbed each other about the state of our fitness. It was the first time in years that I felt truly connected to my past, not in a way that was weighed down by regret or nostalgia, but in a way that felt light, like a reunion with an old friend. When it was time to play, I pulled on my kit, the fabric feeling foreign against my skin after so long. I looked at myself in the mirror, taking in the sight of George Best in a football shirt once again. It was surreal, like I was seeing a version of myself that I thought had been left behind. We took to the field, and as the crowd cheered, I felt a rush of energy I hadn't felt in years. The game itself was relaxed, more of a show than a competition, but it didn't matter. The ball was at my feet again, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I wasn't thinking about the past or the future. I was just playing. I wasn't the player I used to be, of course. My legs didn't have the same speed, my reactions weren't as sharp, but the instincts were still there. Every now and then, I'd pull off a flick or a pass that made the crowd murmur, and I could feel the old magic stirring, if only in flashes. At one point during the game, I found myself one-on-one with the goalkeeper. It wasn't the real deal, the keeper was letting me through, giving me a chance for a bit of glory. But I took it. With a quick shimmy and a flick of the outside of my boot, the ball slipped past him and into the net. The crowd erupted, not with the deafening roar of the old days, but with something warmer, more heartfelt. I jogged back toward the center of the pitch, breathing hard, but smiling. It wasn't about the goal. It wasn't about proving I still had something left in the tank. It was about the joy of the game, the connection to the fans, the chance to feel, even for a moment, like I belonged on the pitch again. After the match, as I walked off the field, I was met with a standing ovation. I waved, feeling a lump in my throat that I hadn't expected. It wasn't the wild adoration I'd known in my prime, but something more meaningful. These people weren't cheering for the legend, the best of old. They were cheering for me, the man who had fallen, who had struggled, but who was still standing. Later that evening, back in the dressing room, we sat around sharing drinks and swapping stories. The conversation turned to the old days, as it always did, but there was no bitterness, no longing for what was lost. Just memories, good ones. One of the lads brought up the night in 1968 when we won the European Cup. "Do you remember, George?" he asked, leaning back with a grin. "That goal, the one that sealed it?" I nodded, smiling at the memory. I remember." And I did. But it wasn't the goal that stood out to me now, all these years later. It was the feeling, the euphoria, the sense of invincibility, like we could do anything. I hadn't felt that in a long time, and I knew I never would again. But I didn't need to. As the night went on, I found myself slipping away from the group, needing a bit of space to clear my head. I wandered back out onto the pitch, now empty, the floodlights casting long shadows across the grass. The stands were quiet, the air still. I walked to the center circle and stood there, staring up at the darkening sky. This was where it had all begun, really. Not Windsor Park, specifically, but the game. Football had been my first love, the thing that had given me everything. And for all the mistakes I'd made, for all the regrets and missed opportunities, I still loved it. That would never change. Standing there, I realized that I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't angry at the game for what it had taken from me, or at myself for what I'd thrown away. It had all been part of the journey, part of what made me who I was, for better or worse. I'd spent so many years running, from the expectations, from the pressure, from myself. But now, I was done running. I didn't know what the future held, but I wasn't afraid of it anymore. I was still here. I was still standing. And that, I realized, was enough. The next morning, as I prepared to leave Belfast and head back to London, I felt a strange sense of peace. The city, the memories, the people, it was all part of me, part of my story. But it wasn't all that I was. There was still more to come, still more life to live. I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. In the months that followed the testimonial match, I found myself reflecting on the nature of legacy. What did it mean to leave something behind, and how did one's past intertwine with the present? My own history was filled with triumphs and failures, but each day, I was reminded that every moment was a chance to redefine myself. After the match, I received countless messages from old fans and new admirers alike. It felt good to know that I still mattered to people, that my story resonated beyond the field. I began to think about how I could use that connection to make a difference. Speaking engagements became more frequent, and I took the opportunity to visit schools and community centers, sharing my story with those who were eager to listen. One of the places I visited was a youth center in a rough neighborhood of Belfast. The kids there faced challenges I could hardly fathom. As I spoke to them about my experiences, I could see the hunger in their eyes, the desire to find a way out, to believe that something better awaited them. Football saved my life, I told them one day, my voice steady. But it wasn't just about the game. It was about the people, the community, the love for something that brought us together. You can find that in anything you do. Just don't give up. One young girl, barely 14, raised her hand. But what if you mess up? What if you lose everything? I paused, remembering my own spiral. I messed up plenty of times. But it's what you do after that counts. You get back up, you keep moving forward. That's how you find your way. Their faces reflected both skepticism and hope. I knew it wouldn't be easy for them. Life wasn't a fairy tale, and the world was full of obstacles. But if I could inspire even one of them to keep fighting, to keep dreaming, then it was worth it. As I became more involved in community work, I also started to reconnect with the sport on a deeper level. I began coaching a local youth team, using the skills I'd honed as a player to teach them not just the game, but also about teamwork, resilience, and respect. It was a new kind of fulfillment, one that filled the void left by my playing days. At the same time, I was still grappling with my past. The temptations were always there, lurking in the shadows. I attended support meetings regularly, surrounded by people who understood the battles I faced. I'd hear their stories, their struggles, and it grounded me in a way that nothing else could. We were all in this together, each trying to carve out a better future. But the darkness would still creep in, especially during quiet moments. I'd find myself sitting alone, memories flooding back, parties, late nights, the chaos that had once consumed me. I had to confront those ghosts, to acknowledge them instead of running away. One night, after a long day of coaching, I sat in my flat with a drink, the weight of it all pressing down on me. I picked up the phone and called one of my old friends, someone who had seen me at my best and my worst. "I'm struggling," I admitted when he picked up. "Some days are just harder than others." "Everyone has those days, George," he said gently. "It's part of being human. You're doing the right thing by talking about it. Don't bottle it up." His words brought me some comfort, but I knew I had to do more than just talk. I began to write down my thoughts, my feelings, and the struggles I faced each day. It became a sort of therapy for me, a way to release the turmoil inside. Months passed, and I kept finding joy in the simplest of things, teaching kids how to dribble, the laughter shared after a good training session, and the sense of community that had blossomed around me. Yet, the shadows still lingered, reminding me that recovery wasn't a straight line. One evening, I received an invitation to a gala event in London, a charity function for mental health awareness. It would be attended by numerous figures from the football world, and I felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. It was a chance to reconnect with the sport on a larger scale, but it also meant facing old demons. As the night approached, I wrestled with anxiety. I put on my best suit, looking in the mirror at a man who was still figuring himself out. It felt strange, both familiar and foreign. Would they see me as the fallen star, or as the man who was trying to rise again? The event was held in a grand hotel, bustling with familiar faces. I was greeted with warmth by some, while others regarded me with a mix of pity and admiration. As I made my way through the crowd, I found comfort in speaking with former teammates, sharing laughs and stories. At one point, I was asked to speak about my experiences, to share my journey. Standing in front of that audience, I felt the weight of my past bearing down on me. But as I spoke, I found my voice. The passion came flooding back. I talked about the joy of the game, the struggles with addiction, and the importance of community. I urge everyone to prioritize mental health, to break the stigma that so often surrounded it. The applause that followed felt genuine, and for a moment, I felt a sense of belonging. I was no longer just George Best, the footballer. I was George Best, a man with a story, one that could help others find their way. As the night wore on, I found myself in conversation with a young player who had just signed with a Premier League club. He was full of hope and ambition, and as he shared his dreams with me, I felt a spark of that youthful excitement return. I wanted to encourage him, to help him navigate the pressures that came with fame. "Enjoy it, but remember why you started," I said. "Keep the love for the game alive, and don't let anything take that away from you." His eyes widened with admiration, and I could see he understood. It was a small moment, but it reminded me of the importance of passing on wisdom, of guiding the next generation. After the gala, I returned to Belfast, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. My work with the youth teams continued, and I started to see the fruits of my labor. The kids were improving, not just as players but as individuals. They began to take pride in their progress, and I felt a sense of fulfillment in being part of their journey. But the reality of my struggles was never far from the surface. I still had moments when the weight of my past felt unbearable. I continued attending support meetings, staying grounded and connected to those who understood. Each conversation reminded me that I wasn't alone, that others were walking similar paths. I began to take care of my health, too, something I had neglected for far too long. I started jogging, rediscovering the simple pleasure of moving my body without the pressure of competition. I embraced the outdoors, often taking long walks along the coast, breathing in the salty air, allowing nature to soothe my soul. One afternoon, as I strolled along the cliffs overlooking the sea, I felt a sense of clarity wash over me. The waves crashing against the rocks echoed the rhythm of my life, constant, relentless, and sometimes tumultuous, but beautiful all the same. It was a reminder that I had weathered storms before, and I could do so again. Life continued to unfold, bringing new challenges and opportunities. I started working on a book, a way to tell my story from my own perspective. It was cathartic, pouring my heart onto the page, reflecting on both the highs and the lows. Writing became a refuge, a place where I could be completely honest with myself. The more I wrote, the more I found healing in the process. I wanted to inspire others, to show them that it was possible to rise from the ashes, to reclaim joy after loss. I poured my experiences into the book, hoping it would resonate with those struggling, those who felt lost like I once did. As I approached the final chapters, I couldn't help but think of the legacy I wanted to leave behind. It wasn't about the trophies or the accolades. It was about the connections I had made, the lives I had touched, and the lessons learned along the way. I realized that my journey wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone who had walked beside me, everyone who had helped shape the man I was becoming. I owed it to them to keep fighting, to keep moving forward. With each word I wrote, I felt lighter, more at peace with my past. I was still George Best, but I was also so much more, a survivor, a mentor, and a man who had finally learned to embrace the present. The past had shaped me, but it didn't define me. And as I put down my pen that day, I knew my story wasn't over yet. There was still more to come. As I continued my journey, I felt an increasing sense of responsibility, not just to my own healing, but to the countless others who were still struggling. My work with the youth teams flourished, and I was invited to more schools and community events, sharing not just my story but also the importance of mental health awareness and resilience. One day, I received an invitation to speak at a national conference on addiction and recovery. It felt like a significant opportunity, and I hesitated only for a moment before accepting. The idea of standing before a large audience, sharing my story in that context, filled me with both excitement and anxiety. As the day approached, I spent hours reflecting on what I wanted to say. I wanted to be honest about the glamour of fame and the depths of despair that followed. I wanted to convey the message that recovery was a journey, not a destination, and that it was okay to stumble along the way. On the day of the conference, I stood backstage, listening to the voices of others sharing their experiences. Their stories were powerful and raw, each one a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. I took a deep breath and reminded myself that I was part of that collective struggle. When it was my turn to speak, I walked onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding me. As I adjusted to the glare, I scanned the audience, faces filled with curiosity, pain, hope. I could feel the weight of my own past pressing down on me, but I embraced it, knowing it was part of what made me who I was. I started with my childhood in Belfast, the joy of discovering football, the thrill of playing for Manchester United, and the adoration that came with it. I spoke candidly about my descent into addiction, the highs and lows that followed, the moments of darkness that felt insurmountable. I didn't shy away from the mistakes I had made or the people I had hurt. Instead, I spoke about the lessons learned, the grace of second chances. As I shared my story, I could see nods of understanding, tears welling in some eyes. It felt like a connection, a reminder that we were all in this together, that no one was alone in their struggles. By the end of my talk, I emphasized the importance of reaching out for help and finding a support network. When I stepped off the stage, I was met with a wave of applause. It was gratifying, yes, but more importantly, it felt like a validation of everything I had been through. The conversations that followed were heartfelt. Many people approached me, sharing their own stories and thanking me for my honesty. It was a powerful reminder that my voice mattered. After the conference, I continued to work on my book, drawing inspiration from the feedback I received. I was determined to make it a resource for those struggling with addiction and for anyone who felt lost. I wanted to create something that would resonate, something that could be a beacon of hope. Meanwhile, my involvement with the youth teams took on new significance. I realized that many of these kids faced challenges similar to those I had at their age. I began to incorporate discussions about mental health into our training sessions. We talked about pressure, expectations, and the importance of taking care of one another. It was about creating a safe space for them to express their fears and aspirations. One day, while coaching a group of teenagers, I noticed one young lad sitting apart from the others. He looked lost, and something about his demeanor tugged at my heart. After practice, I approached him. "Hey, mate. You okay?" I asked gently. He shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "Just a lot on my mind." I could see the weight he carried, and I remembered feeling that same heaviness at his age. "You know, it's all right to talk about it. I've had my share of struggles too. You're not alone." He hesitated, but eventually opened up about the pressures he felt from school and his family to succeed in football. As we talked, I shared my own experiences, the importance of balancing dreams with mental well-being. By the end of our conversation, I could see a flicker of hope in his eyes. "I thought I had to handle it all by myself," he admitted. "You don't have to. That's what we're here for, supporting each other," I replied, feeling a sense of purpose wash over me. In moments like these, I saw the impact of my journey, not just on myself but on the lives of others. It was a reminder that healing wasn't a solitary path. It was a collective effort, a community of shared experiences and mutual support. As the months turned into years, I kept writing, refining my book. Each chapter was a piece of my soul, a testament to resilience and hope. I wanted to inspire, to show that life could be beautiful even after the darkest times. One afternoon, I received a call from a publisher who had heard about my project. They were interested in my book, and the conversation sparked a renewed excitement within me. This was it, the opportunity to share my story with a wider audience, to help others find their way. As I worked with the publisher, I was reminded of the responsibility that came with sharing my truth. My story was mine, but it was also a reflection of countless others who had faced similar battles. I wanted to be a voice for those who felt unheard, those who struggled in silence. The process of editing and revising was cathartic. I pored over every detail, ensuring my message was clear. I wanted to balance the highs and lows, to convey the beauty of resilience while acknowledging the harsh realities of addiction. Finally, the day came when my book was ready for release. I felt a mix of excitement and anxiety, knowing that my past would be laid bare for the world to see. But as the launch approached, I remembered why I was doing this. It was about hope, connection, and the possibility of change. On the night of the launch, I stood in a small bookstore filled with familiar faces, friends, family, former teammates, and supporters. It felt surreal, like a culmination of everything I had fought for. As I took the stage to speak, I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. "This isn't just my story," I began, my voice steady. "It's ours. It's a reminder that we can rise from the ashes, that we can heal, and that we can help one another along the way." The applause that followed felt like a warm embrace, and in that moment, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. My journey was far from over, but I was ready to embrace whatever came next. I had found my purpose, not just in football, but in life. And as I looked out at the faces in the crowd, I knew that together, we could inspire change, one story at a time. The days following the launch of my book were a whirlwind. I was invited to various events, radio shows, and podcasts to discuss my journey and the messages within the pages. It felt surreal, sharing my story with a broader audience, but I embraced the opportunity wholeheartedly. Each interview was a chance to connect, to reach out to someone who might be struggling, to remind them that hope existed. The response was overwhelming. I received messages from people all over the world, some sharing their own battles with addiction, others expressing how my story had inspired them to seek help. It was humbling and reaffirming, a reminder that my experiences, while painful, could serve a greater purpose. One day, while I was at a local community center giving a talk, a woman approached me afterward. She had tears in her eyes. "Your story saved my son's life," she said, her voice shaking. "He was in such a dark place, but hearing you speak made him realize he wasn't alone." In that moment, I understood the true impact of sharing my journey. It wasn't just about recounting my past. It was about fostering connection, building a community of support, and offering hope to those who needed it most. As I continued to speak at various events, I found myself increasingly passionate about mental health advocacy. I decided to collaborate with local charities focused on addiction recovery and youth programs. We organized workshops and events, creating safe spaces for people to share their stories and seek help. During one event, I met a young man named Liam. He was bright, with a quick smile, but I could see shadows behind his eyes. As we talked, he opened up about his struggles with addiction and the pressure he felt from his peers. It was a tough conversation, but as I shared my own experiences, I saw him begin to relax. "Just remember, Liam," I said, "it's okay to ask for help. You don't have to face this alone." He nodded, and I could see the flicker of hope in his eyes. In that moment, I felt the weight of my journey transform into purpose. I wasn't just a former footballer, I was someone who could make a difference. As the months rolled by, my commitment to advocacy grew. I organized charity matches featuring former players, bringing the community together while raising awareness for mental health issues. These events became more than just games, they were celebrations of resilience, connection, and support. Then came the day I received an unexpected call. It was an invitation to attend a major charity gala in London, where I would be honored for my work in addiction recovery. I felt a rush of gratitude, but also a sense of responsibility. I knew that this recognition was not just for me, it was for everyone who had shared their stories and fought their battles alongside me. At the gala, surrounded by influential figures from various fields, I felt a mix of nerves and excitement. As I took the stage to accept the award, I reflected on how far I had come. I spoke about the importance of community, the power of vulnerability, and the need to break the stigma surrounding mental health. "We all have a story," I said, my voice steady. "And each story has the potential to heal, to inspire, and to change lives. Let's continue to lift each other up, to support one another, and to create a world where no one has to suffer in silence." The applause was deafening, but it wasn't the accolades that mattered most to me. It was the sense of connection, the understanding that I was part of something larger than myself. As I returned to Belfast after the gala, I felt a sense of fulfillment that I had never known during my football career. The game had given me joy, fame, and heartbreak, but this new chapter was about giving back, about helping others find their way. In the following years, I continued to balance my advocacy work with my passion for football. I often returned to the pitch, not just to coach but to play in charity matches. Each time I stepped onto the field, I felt the old excitement, but now it was different. It was about community, about connection, and about joy. Eventually, I decided to take a leap and start a foundation focused on mental health and addiction recovery. With the support of friends and former teammates, we aimed to provide resources, workshops, and support for those in need. It was a dream come true, a way to ensure that my story continued to make a difference long after I was gone. One sunny afternoon, we held the first event for the foundation, a family-friendly festival celebrating life and resilience. The atmosphere was electric. Children laughed, families mingled, and stories were shared. As I looked around, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for everyone who had walked this journey with me. As the sun began to set, I took a moment to stand on the sidelines, watching the kids play football. I was reminded of my own childhood, the joy I had found in the game. And in that moment, I realized how far I had come. I had once been a boy from Belfast, chasing a dream that took me to unimaginable heights, only to face the depths of despair. Now I stood as a man who had embraced his past, learned from it, and used it to uplift others. Life had come full circle. I had finally found my place, not just as a footballer, but as a mentor, a friend, and a voice for those who needed it most. I knew that my journey would continue, with all its challenges and triumphs, but I was ready to embrace whatever came next. As I walked back to the pitch, I felt the warmth of the sun on my face, and I smiled. My story was still being written, and I was determined to make it one worth telling. Thank you for listening.